Welcome to the deep dive. Today, well, we're plunging headfirst into some really heavy-hitting literature.
hmm
This comes from a listener, actually, who shared a specific chunk of Fyodor Dostoyevsky's massive novel, The Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah, we're talking about this section known as the Grand Inquisitor. And it's not like a normal chapter. It's this fictional poem or story that even Karamazov tells his brother Alyosha.
Right, this imagined dialogue between Christ and the Grand Inquisitor.
Exactly. Set against the Spanish Inquisition.
So our mission, really, is to get inside this critique, the one Dostoyevsky presents through Avon. Understand the core ideas, the pretty shocking arguments he makes.
And the big questions it raises, right?
Yeah.
About freedom, happiness, faith, human nature itself.
We'll be pulling directly from the text provided, trying to unpack those key parts.
Yeah, trying to get at not just what happens, but why Ivan tells this story, what points he's making through the Inquisitor.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Ivan sets the scene really vividly. 16th century Seville, Spain.
Right in the heart of it, the Spanish Inquisition. A time known for, well, religious authority and maybe not so much freedom. And Ivan notes that back then it was common in art, in plays, to show heavenly figures, interacting with people.
Like the Madonna, saints, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and he mentions this older Byzantine poem, too, The Travels of the Mother of God Among the Damned, where Mary actually visits hell.
Wow. And intercedes for the damned. That's a powerful idea. Divine intervention right in the midst of suffering.
Exactly. So into this specific setting, Christ returns.
Silently, the text says. No grand entrance.
No, but somehow everyone just knows it's him instantly. He appears and people just flock to him.
And straight away, miracles happen. A blind man cries out, "Lord, heal me."
And he sees again. Then there's the scene at the cathedral, a crowd mourning a little girl, just 7 years old, in her coffin.
The mother pleads with him.
And he says just those 2 words from the gospel, Talita Kumi. Rise, little girl.
And she does. She sits up in her coffin.
The crowd just erupts, weeping, shouting, Hosanna. Absolute certainty, total adoration, pure joy, pure faith.
And this is where Ivan's story takes that really sharp turn. Right in the middle of all this joy, the Cardinal Grand Inquisitor shows up.
Yeah, this imposing figure, almost 90, tall, stern.
You
know the
So
stuff.
he sees the resurrection happen right in front of him.
You'd think maybe awe, reverence.
Nope.
No. The text says his face darkens, his eyes flash, and he immediately orders his guards, the Holy Guard, arrest him, arrest Christ.
And the crowd, this is the shocking part, the crowd that was just shouting Hosanna.
They fall silent. Just let it happen. Submissively. The Inquisitor's authority just completely crushes their spontaneous joy.
So Christ is led away, thrown into this dark, narrow prison cell.
It's a powerful setup, isn't it? This immediate clash, divine freedom, grace, met with institutional power, control, suppression, sets the stage.
For the real confrontation, which happens that night.
The Inquisitor goes to the cell alone, lantern in hand, stands before Christ. Long silence, the text says.
Scrutiny. He knows who it is. It is thou, he says.
Yes, but then immediately forbids him to speak. Not a word. Tells Christ he has no right to add anything, not a syllable to what he said before.
That's crucial, isn't it? The Inquisitor sees Christ's presence, just his potential to speak, as a threat, a direct threat to their work.
Precisely. He says, you've come to impede us in our work. He knows it. And then the bombshell.
He's gonna burn him as a heretic tomorrow.
And those same people who adored him, they'll be the first ones rushing to pile wood on the fire at the Inquisitor's command.
Alyosha, listening to Ivan tell this, he thinks it's just crazy. Maybe the old man's delusional,
Understandable reaction. But Ivan insists, no, that's the whole point. This is the moment. The Inquisitor finally gets to voice this secret thought he's held for 90 years. And Ivan explains those first words from the Inquisitor. They basically lay out the core idea Ivan's attacking, which he ties to Roman Catholicism, or at least parts of it. Everything was given over by thee to the Pope. Everything now rests with him alone. Thou hast no business to return and thus hinder us.
It's a claim of total authority. Like, we've got this covered now, you stay out.
Yeah. And the Inquisitor tells Christ that coming back, revealing anything new, would interfere with wait for it, the freedom Christ gave people.
Freedom, how does that work?
Exactly. Here's the twist. He claims the church has spent 15 centuries not just managing freedom, but actively conquering and subjecting it.
Conquering freedom.
Yes. And he claims they did it in thy name, for humanity's own good. He argues that only now, by giving their freedom over to the church, can people finally feel secure in it. He paints it as this great service.
A service. by taking away their freedom. That sounds like a paradox.
It is the paradox he presents. He says man is born a rebel, and rebels can never be happy. And he claims Christ was warned about this, that Christ rejected the only path to human happiness, essentially leaving the church to clean up the mess.
Okay. And this is where he brings up the 3 temptations in the wilderness.
Ringo, he calls them a genuine striking wonder, a marvelous miracle, says they contain the complete subsequent history of man, all the big problems, the contradictions of human nature.
So this is his whole framework. He's going to use those 3 temptations to justify his way, the church's way, over Christ's way, for the sake of human happiness.
Right. Let's start with his take on temptation number 1, turn stones into bread.
Okay. The tempter says, use your divine power, feed the hungry. Christ refuses, man shall not live by bread alone.
The Inquisitor says, big mistake. Should have done it. He claims that by rejecting earthly bread, Christ chose spiritual freedom, but at a terrible cost. He actually says, never was there anything more unbearable to the human race than personal freedom.
Wow. Freedom is the most unbearable thing. That's a statement.
He thinks so. He argues if Christ had just provided the bread, people would have followed him like happy, obedient sheep. Grateful.
But still fearful, he adds.
Right, but obedient. He thinks Christ rejecting the bread denied people the simple choice where they could have been essentially bribed into obedience with guaranteed food.
So the argument is Christ missed the most basic human need, security, food, before anything else.
That's his argument. He predicts science will eventually say there's no sin, only hunger, and people will revolt under the banner. Feed us first, then ask us to be virtuous.
And he uses this to say Christ could have stopped all that future suffering just by making bread.
Yeah, and in his future vision, humanity tries to build its own Tower of Babel without the church, fails because they can't feed themselves, and then comes crawling back.
Crawling back to the church.
Begging to be fed, saying basically, those guys who promised us fire from heaven, meaning maybe spiritual freedom, they lied. And the church will finish the tower by feeding them, claiming it's in Christ's name.
But knowing, secretly.
Knowing they'll never learn to feed themselves without our help.
So the core idea here, the Inquisitor's big claim, is that freedom and universal earthly security, like guaranteed bread for all, they just don't mix. They're incompatible.
Exactly, because people are too weak, too inherently flawed, too vicious, he says, to handle freedom and divide the bread fairly.
And maybe a few strong souls, thousands maybe, could follow Christ for the heavenly bread.
But the millions, the weak masses, they need earthly bread. And they are the ones the church cares about for its purpose. The church will herd them into obedience.
And they'll worship the church leaders like gods.
As gods, for taking away the terrible burden of freedom.
People want this. They want to be told what to do, given bread, and just relieved of the pain of choosing.
That's his claim. And he says the church will rule in thy name, but it's a deception, a lie. And this deception, this constant burden of lying for what they believe is humanity's own good, that's the suffering the church leaders endure.
Okay, so temptation 1 boils down to this universal craving, to worship something together, under one banner. And the Inquisitor says earthly bread would have been that banner, silencing conscience by removing free choice.
Right. He says the real mystery isn't just living, it's what you live for. Without a common purpose, a common object of worship, people just destroy themselves. Christ, he argues, gave more freedom instead of less.
He didn't understand that people prefer rest, even death, to the agony of choosing between good and evil.
That's the Inquisitor's point. Free conscience is just too painful for most. Christ put this impossible burden on humanity, valued them too highly, gave them free choice, guided only by his example.
Which, in the Inquisitor's view, just set them up to fail and destroy his own kingdom.
Yeah, okay, so that leads to the second temptation. The Inquisitor identifies these 3 forces that can conquer human conscience: miracle, mystery, and authority.
And he says Christ rejected all 3.
Starting with the second temptation. Jump from the temple pinnacle. Prove you're the Son of God with a miracle.
The tempter's challenge, which Christ refused.
Right. The Inquisitor acknowledges it was a refusal born of divine pride, not tempting God. But he argues, ordinary people, they're not gods. They can't understand why you'd refuse such clear proof.
Christ wanted faith, not proof. He hoped people would follow his example without needing dazzling miracles.
But the Inquisitor says, nope. Man cannot live without miracles. If you reject miracles, you basically reject God, because people seek signs, wonders, more than they seek God himself.
So if they don't get divine miracles,
They'll just make up their own. They'll follow fortune tellers, witches, anyone who offers them a sign, a marvel.
he also brings up Christ not coming down from the cross here, right? Another refusal to use overwhelming power.
Exactly. Refusing to enslave people through a miracle. Christ wanted free faith, not the adoration of slaves terrified by power.
But the Inquisitor sees this as Christ judging people too harshly, demanding too much.
He thinks it would have been more loving to demand less, to esteem them less, to make their burden lighter by just giving them the undeniable proof they crave. He calls human rebellion just petty vanity.
So, for the second temptation, the core message is people need visible proof. They need signs. They need mystery to submit to and authority to tell them what's true. Abstract faith and freedom. Too much. Too confusing.
Exactly. Christ rejecting miracle, mystery, and authority just leaves people lost, leads to chaos. He sums up the result of Christ's path as unrest, confusion, misery.
He talks about Christ's elect, the few who could handle the burden. But what about the millions who are too weak? Why punish weakness?
Which leads him to say, well, if Christ was only for the elect, then his message is a mystery. And the church was right to preach it as such, to teach obedience to this incomprehensible mystery rather than pushing for that difficult freedom.
So the church corrected Christ's work.
Corrected and improved, he says, by basing everything squarely on miracle, mystery, and authority. And people rejoiced. They were glad to be led like sheep, finally relieved of that awful burden of freedom.
And the church shows its love how? By recognizing their helplessness.
Yes, easing their burden and even, he says, permitting sin, as long as it's done with the church's authorization.
Permitting sin. That's pretty radical. How does that work?
Because the church takes the sin onto itself. The leaders become the scapegoats for the masses. They ease the people's conscience by allowing sin, but taking the ultimate responsibility.
Which then brings us to the Inquisitor's big reveal. His secret.
Yeah, after laying all this out, explaining how the church responded to the failures inherent in the first two temptations, he drops it. We are not with thee, but with him, and that is our secret.
Him.
The spirit from the third temptation, the one who offered Christ all the kingdoms of the world.
So he's flat out saying the church, or his faction anyway, secretly sided with the devil, with the tempter.
Essentially, yes. He claims that for 8 centuries, Ivan puts it around the 800s AD, this group gave up on Christ and accepted the gifts he rejected.
The kingdoms of the world. Worldly power.
Exactly. The glaive of Caesar, political power, imperial authority.
Why? To create a universal kingdom.
Right. He argues this fulfills humanity's third great need, the necessity for universal union. He thinks all great conquerors, all empires, were unconsciously striving for this.
So taking Caesar's power lets them build one world government, guarantee peace. And he thinks the ones who control conscience and bread are the best people to rule.
That's the logic. And he says once they accepted that power, they had to deny Christ and follow the tempter.
He predicts more chaos first, though, like centuries of free thought leading to self-destruction.
Yeah, intellectual riot and rebellious free thought sounds like the Enlightenment, right? He predicts it ends in anthropophagy, basically people destroying each other because they tried to build their own tower without the church, without miracle, mystery, authority.
And only after that collapse, humanity, which he calls the beast, will finally submit completely, licking the church's feet.
Grim picture, isn't it? He uses imagery from Revelation, the church sitting on the beast, holding the golden cup full of filth with mystery written on it. Only then, he claims, will real peace and happiness begin.
He contrasts Christ's focus on the few, the elect, with the church's mission to give rest to everyone.
Yes. He even blames Christ for people eventually using his banner of freedom against him, saying they just got tired of the burden.
Under the church's rule, though, everyone will be happy. No more rebellion, no self-destruction.
That's the promise. The church will prove that true freedom only comes when you give your freedom to the church.
Because people will finally see where Christ's path led to slavery, strife, confusion.
Exactly. Into impassable chasms, facing mysteries they couldn't handle, driving them to destruction until they crawl back, begging the church to save them from themselves.
They'll see the church gives back the bread it takes, fairly distributed, unlike their own failed attempts.
Right. The church, which he admits helped scatter the flock at first, will now gather them and rule them forever, proving humanity's weakness, making them humble again. He says Christ made them too proud by valuing them too highly.
So the promise is, what kind of happiness?
Quiet, humble happiness. making people timid, obedient, like little chicks around a mother hen, worshiping their powerful leaders.
They'll fear the church, their minds will weaken, they'll cry easily like children.
But the church will teach them how to quickly go from grief to joy. They'll work like slaves, he says, but they'll have innocent, childlike fun allowed to them.
And the sin thing again. They'll love the church for permitting sin.
Yeah, because they'll be told it's all forgiven if done with permission.
Because the leaders take the burden of sin onto themselves. The scapegoat idea again, earning adoration.
And people will have no secrets. They'll confess everything, relieving themselves of the agony of free decision-making.
So under this system, everyone is happy.
Well, almost everyone. Except, he says, the 100,000 or 200,000 of their rulers. Only the leaders, the keepers of the great mystery, will be miserable. That's his claim. They are the true martyrs. They know the truth, the deception, maybe lack of God, the lack of an afterlife for the masses, and they bear that terrible knowledge of good and evil so everyone else can live in blissful ignorance.
So the masses die peacefully, thinking they're going to heaven.
While the leaders know there's nothing after death for them, but keep up the mirage of life eternal to maintain order and happiness.
He even confronts the prophecies of Christ's return. Says his church saved everyone, not just the elect. He challenges Christ to judge him, saying he'll show the millions of happy, sinless infants.
Yeah, he claims he doesn't fear judgment. He says he was once out there in the wilderness too, loving freedom. But he awoke from that delusion. He joined the ones who corrected thy mistakes to help the truly humble.
He's completely confident their kingdom will be built. And he warns Christ again, the flock will burn you tomorrow if you interfere. And then silence. He finishes speaking.
It's just an incredibly powerful, deeply disturbing argument he lays out.
Absolutely. So how does Alyosha, the spiritual brother, react when Ivan finishes telling this story?
Well, Alyosha's pretty shaken up. He calls the poem absurd. He doesn't buy the deep philosophical suffering bit.
He just sees it as an attack.
Yeah, basically an attack on the Catholic Church, the Inquisition, the Jesuits. He thinks they're just cynics hungry for power, for mean and earthly pleasures. No real mystery, no profound suffering involved, just hypocrisy.
He thinks the Inquisitor is just using religion for control.
Pretty much. But Ivan pushes back. He laughs and asks, okay, maybe most are like that, but couldn't there be just one genuine martyr among them?
Like his Inquisitor.
Yeah, someone who really did suffer in the wilderness, really did love humanity, but came to the honest, tragic conclusion that Christ's way, that high ideal, was just impossible for the masses.
So Ivan is suggesting the Inquisitor isn't just a cardboard villain. He could be a tragic figure, believing he's doing the right thing, but through terrible means.
That's the possibility Ivan raises. He agrees with Alyosha that the Inquisitor probably doesn't believe in God anymore. And that's his secret.
And his suffering.
And his deepest suffering, Ivan argues. For a man who maybe once devoted his whole life to Christ's ideal, loved humanity, but then concluded it just leads the weak rebels, these half-finished samples, to misery.
So he felt he had to follow the tempter's advice to make life tolerable for them.
That's Ivan's interpretation. It means accepting lies, deception, leading people towards, well, maybe destruction ultimately, but keeping them happy and unaware along the way. And doing it all in the name of the very ideal he no longer believes is achievable. That's the suffering.
Ivan even speculates about a secret league of these kinds of leaders, guiding things for centuries, guarding the mystery, their unbelief and deception for the sake of mass happiness. Throws in the Masons as maybe having a similar secret.
Right. It adds this really complex layer. The Inquisitor isn't just evil. He's grappling with a terrible conclusion about humanity and making choices out of a kind of twisted pity or love.
So after this whole intense monologue and Ivan's defense of the Inquisitor's potential complexity, how does the poem actually end?
Well, Christ has been silent the whole time, right?
Yeah.
After the Inquisitor finishes, Christ doesn't say a word. He just stands up, walks over to the old man, the 90-year-old Inquisitor, and softly kisses him on his bloodless old lips.
A kiss. That's the only answer.
That's it. No argument, no rebuttal. Just this silent, maybe sorrowful, maybe loving act.
And how does the Inquisitor react to the kiss? Does it change him?
The text says he shudders. There's like a twitch around his lips. But no, he doesn't change his mind. He sticks to his ideas, his unbelief.
And then what?
He goes to the cell door, opens it, and tells Christ, go, and return no more. Do not come again. Never, never.
Lets him go.
Let him go. Out into the dark city streets, the prisoner vanishes.
And Alyosha is disturbed by this ending. asks Ivan if he believes what the Inquisitor believes.
And Ivan just laughs, which, in Dostoyevsky, a laugh is never simple. Leaves you wondering about Ivan himself.
Wow, okay. This whole deep dive, it really forces you to grapple with some enormous questions, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Like, what is true freedom? Is it that heavy burden of choice Christ offered? Or is it the security, the managed happiness the Inquisitor promises, even if it's built on lies?
And the Inquisitor's argument that people deep down want someone to worship, someone to hand their freedom over to. Do you see that playing out today? I mean, look around.
Yeah. And those three temptations, he frames everything around bread, miracle, authority, security, signs, strong leadership. How do those forces shape our world now? How do they push against individual freedom, individual conscience?
And if we take Ivan's suggestions seriously, that the Inquisitor genuinely suffers, what does that tell us? About the cost, the psychological toll of believing you're acting for the greater good, but using means that betray the very ideals you claim to serve.
It's such a powerful, unsettling piece. It's not just history or theology, it's philosophy about the human condition. Still feels incredibly relevant.
Totally. And that image of the kiss, burning the Inquisitor's heart, he says later. But he still doesn't change. It's unforgettable. That unwavering conviction, maybe self-deception.
And think about that final act. The Inquisitor doesn't kill Christ. He lets him go, but commands him never to return, banishes him from the system he's building. What does that tell us about his real fear, his real goal?
Yeah, definitely a lot to chew on there.
For sure. Well, that's all for this deep dive. We really hope it gives you plenty to think about.